Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Dear viewers, I welcome you all on the lecture number 7 on the topic of interpretation of statutes. My name is Dr. Ajay Sonavne, Assistant Professor, Faculty of Law, University of Delhi. So today we will be discussing on the topic of rules of interpretation part 2. As in the lecture number 6 we have discussed about the rules of interpretation part 1. So we will now discuss the remaining rules which are applicable while interpretation of statutes which are associated with it. So in this lecture, what rules that we are going to cover, let us have a look at it. First, we will discuss the rule ut res magis valet quam paterit. Second, rule of purposive construction. Third, interpretation of penal statutes and rule interpretation of tax statutes. Then ejusdus generis principle. Then noscitur saucis and rule of harmonious construction. So these are some of the more rules that we have to understand when we interpret the statutes. So to begin with the first one. So in the first rule, that is ut res magis valet quam paret. What do you mean by this? What is the meaning of this rule? So here it is, if we go by the literal meaning, it says that it is better for a thing to have effect than to be made void. So better to interpret the law to consider it valid rather than declaring it invalid. So the purpose of this particular principle is that the attempt has to be given by the judiciary or by the lawyers or by the learners to a particular law in such a manner that it should give effect to that rather than declaring as a invalid. So this doctrine is applicable in the interpretation of an instrument, document or a deed. So this doctrine is not only applicable to the law or statute, this doctrine is also applicable when the matter, if it is concerned with the document, if it is concerned with the deed or if it is concerned with certain legal instrument. So wherein the attempt or the emphasis has to be given for what? The emphasis has to be given for giving the validity to the law rather than declaring as a invalid. So a sensible meaning has to be given to the words of law. A specific object, purpose, intention of the legislature that should be taken out to give the meaning to the words of the particular interpretation of statutes. And further, the court must give an attempt to interpret a reasonable manner to find out the meaning of the words of the statutes. Court shall not give the meaning to the words in such a manner that that law will lead to the nature that is invalid. So better the court shall give a maximum or the best attempt to interpret the law in such a manner that that law will becomes the valid one. So to make it effective and operative rather than becoming null or void. A particular statute's prima facie may have been challenged as a void or vague, but the court on the basis of this maxim bring out the construction in such a manner and that a particular statute remains within the purview of law. Because dear viewers, you can just see one process that whenever law is made by the parliament, then parliament generally comes out with certain law with certain intention, certain objective, certain purpose. And while if that law is brought in the society or brought in the public, then one has to understand that there is certain history, there is certain object purpose behind that. And if the certain provisions are unable to get the clarity or certain provisions are not giving the clear words or ambiguity, then in that case one cannot directly go and declare that law as invalid, or even the judge cannot directly make that law invalid. But judge also needs to understand that why this law should be declared invalid. Are there any reasons as a valid one? So therefore this particular maxim aims to get this idea that how this law can be becomes valid. So here we have certain again landmark cases. Court case. Now in this case the appellant basically was prosecuted for a theft, and theft is what? Regarding the electrical energy from the Punjab State Electricity Board, and was convicted. Now he filed the appeal and he has raised one very pertinent question So if you see under section 39 of the Indian Electricity Act, what it says that whoever dishonestly abstracts, consumes or uses any energy shall deem to have committed a theft within the meaning of the IPC. So a person has stolen, or you can say theft, the electric energy. So, and according to the Punjab State Electricity Board, he has committed a crime and therefore he was convicted. But according to the appellant, that is Avtar Singh, that he has not, the conviction which has done, that is illegal. He has not denied that whether he has stolen the or theft the electrical energy or not, but his contention is simply relied upon his conviction. According to him, conviction is wrong. So what is further sections that we have here? The section 50 now. Section 50 plays an important role here to understand the contention that is put up by the appellant, that is Avtar Singh. He has, with the help of sections 50, he has mentioned that no prosecution shall be instituted against any person for any offence of the against the act, except at the instance the government or electrical inspector or a person aggrieved by the same. So here, if you read the section 50, it says that a prosecution cannot be initiated when or only, or it can be initiated only when that at the instance that if the government or if the electrical inspector or a person aggrieved by the same, if he filed the complaint or he approached to the court or approached to the police station against this particular theft that is done by someone, or for that matter any provision of this Indian Electricity Act, then and then only that complaint can be considered as a valid and the prosecution can be initiated. If these three people have not filed the complaint or have not approached to the court, and there is some fourth one who has approached to the court on the basis of this section 39 of the Indian Electricity Act, which is related to the theft or for that matter any provision of the act, then it has no value. So therefore, this appellant contention is that his prosecution was for an offence against the act and it was incompetent, as it had been established that it had been instituted at the instance of any persons mentioned in section 50. So there is no proof or there is no evidence that either whether it was a government or whether it was electrical inspector or whether it was a person who was affected by it, whether either any of them has approached to the court, there is no evidence for that. So therefore, in such case, whether the theft of electricity is an offence against the act or not. So therefore, in this case, court has referred one previous judgment, and that is Emperor versus Vishwanath, which was decided by the Allahabad High Court, wherein the offence was not an offence against the act because it was one punishable under the provisions of section 379 of the Indian Penal Code. We think that this would not have been offence under section 379 of the Indian Penal Code if it had not been for the provisions of the section 39 of the Indian Electricity Act. So it was therefore an offence which was created by that section, and the legislature intended section 50 to apply to an offence of this nature. Hence the appeal was allowed and the conviction of the appellant was set aside. So here, however, he must have theft the electricity energy, but also there is a requirement which is mentioned by the act itself that the concerned person, either it is electrical engineer or inspector or the government or any person who is affected by the same, only this will have the right to approach to the authorities and the prosecution will be started. If any third person approaching to them, then it will have no value, and even court cannot initiate the proceeding in that regard. So therefore, in this case, this conviction was set aside and this appeal was allowed. Similarly, we have one more case, that is Corporation of Calcutta versus Liberty Cinema, 1965. Now here, this case is basically related to the cinema house and it's related to the taxes or the fees. So here, respondent having this owner of Liberty Cinema, so he was carrying a business of this public cinema shows, and the appellant was the corporation constituted by the Kolkata Municipal Act 1951. So the respondent had obtained a license under the act and had been paying a license fee to the appellant corporation. So the corporation by resolution changed the basis of assessment of license fee as according to sitting capacity of cinema houses. Because when the corporation, that is Kolkata Municipal Act, when they are going to charge the fee for the license, so it depends upon the capacity of cinema houses. If cinema houses consisting of 500 seats, then there will be a particular fee. If it is consisting of 1000 seats, then again the fee will be increased. So accordingly, the license fee will be revised every time. So council, this corporation, by passing the resolution, they had increased the license fee. So whether this resolution in enhancing the license fee was under the act valid, and whether the word fee means fee for service or fee for tax. Now here the question arises that word used, that is fee, because when the license fee is charged, whether that is basically for the service which they are rendering or for the tax which they are, no, for the money which they are generating from it, and that by way of tax they are paying the fee. That was the question. So here the court analyze various provisions of Kolkata Municipal Act 1951 and observe that section 443 of the said act provides that no person shall, without license granted by corporation, keep open any cinema houses for the public amusement. So that is fine. So as a this cinema house owner, his respondent is basically having the license. There is no question about that. But section 548(2) says that for every license under the act, a fee may, unless otherwise provided, be charged at such rate as may time to time be provided. So law itself gives the power to the municipal corporation to revise the fee whenever it is required. So intention is not use the word fee as referring only to levy in return of services. Okay. So the statute has to be read so as to make it valid, and if possible, interpretation leading to a contrary position should be avoided. It has to be construed ut res magis valet quam perit. So the word fee in section 548 should be read as meaning of tax, for it made no provision for services to be rendered, and any other reading would make the section invalid. So therefore Justice Sarkar here held that the word fee in section 548 means tax, and in the result allowed the appeal of the corporation. So the word fee, if we just take it as it is for the matter of service, then section will have no value. So to give the section some value, rather than declaring as invalid or rather than declaring as invalid just because of one particular incidence, so it will also again not survive the purpose. So the word fee, it also include the term tax. That was emphasized by the court by applying this principle of ut res magis valet quam perit. So now let's move to the next rule of interpretation, that is rule of purposive construction. So this is an extension of the mischief rule. So mischief rule, as we have discussed in the rule lecture number 6, wherein the mischief rule is nothing but is based upon the Haydon's rule, and the Haydon rule has given the 4 proposition or question which needs to be understood while understanding the mischief rule. So this is rule of purposive construction is an extension for that. Now what is the extension? So here, when a court find a glitch in the interpretation of an act, then they apply the rule to give effect. Every act court needs to promote that intended purpose and the spirit of the act. And also that while interpretation of this particular rule or the law, the necessary to remove the anomaly or hardship by applying the purpose of contextual or the contextual construction. So this rule of purposive construction is definitely this word purposive, that definitely highlight or that gives the emphasis that every act is definitely enacted for some purpose, for some object, and that it is the duty of the court that to promote that intention, that purpose, that object or the spirit of act, and that is possible when that can be constructed in the similar manner by the court. So like in the even in the mischief rule, if you remember that in the mischief rule also, that when we see that the remedy which has been resolved by the act, even that has to be justified, and what is the reason behind that remedy, so that ultimately gives the purpose about that respective act. So similarly in the purposive construction, as I mentioned, it is just an extension of this mischief rule. So also there are certain important cases here just to understand the application of this purposive construction. So we have first case here, this Raven-Steinitz versus State of Madhya Pradesh 1977. So in this particular case, this case is basically between there is a law which was challenged in the court, and that is from the Madhya Pradesh and Orissa. So these two states are in the consideration in this case. So there was a controversy in the Madhya Pradesh cases related to the Madhya Pradesh Dharma Swatantralay Adhiniyam 1968, And the controversy in the Orissa arises out of the Orissa Freedom of Religion Act 1967. So the question was raised by the appellant against the provisions of the two acts insofar as they relate to the prohibition or forcible conversion and the punishment. So as you know that like in India, when we talk about Article 25 of the Constitution of India, then there is a freedom of religion and there is a freedom to profess, practice, propagate any religion. And obviously if there is a forcible conversion, then obviously that is prohibited by the law, and therefore it is liable for the punishment. So in this case, this two act, that is Madhya Pradesh and the freedom of religion of this Orissa Act, this both rules or laws were in question. So a preliminary objection raised that a state legislature did not have the necessary legislative competence, and the Madhya Pradesh Act was the ultra virus to the constitution, as it did not fall within the purview of entry 1 of list 2 and entry 1 of list 3 of the 7th schedule, because list 3 of this is basically a talk about concurrent list, and list 2 basically talks about the state list, right? So according to the contention or objection which was raised, that there is no legislative competence for the state to enact such kind of rules or such kind of act which talks about the religion and the rules and regulation about the same. So according to the appellant, it was covered by the entry 7 of the list 1. So entry 7 of the list 1 is again what? It is the union list. So it is basically the matter in the hand of parliament. So parliament has the right, if they have to make the law, that the central legislation can be made, or central authority will have or the parliament will have the authority to make the law in this regard. So the parliament alone had the power to make law and not the state legislature. So the objection was also raised that the provision of section 3, 4 and 5 of the same act are contravening the article 25 of the constitution, and therefore that should be declared void. So the magistrate took the view that there was no force in objection. Further, additional session judge as well as High Court did not find it ultra virus. So when the matter came before at the lower court, and they found that there is no objection as such, the provisions of this both the act, that is Madhya Pradesh as well as Orissa, both are well within the law. So here the next point that is highlighted here, that is Article 25, that every person has a right to profess his own religion and to act according to it. Any interference with that right of other person by resorting to conversion by force, fraud or allurement cannot, in our opinion, be said to contravene the Article 25(1) of the Constitution, because it guarantees the religious freedom that is subject to the public health, morality and order. Public health, morality and public order. Okay. So as such, even a High Court did not find that provision of section 3 and 4 and 5 of the MP Dharma Swatantra Niyam Adhiniyam 1968 are violative of the Article 25(1) of the Constitution. So lower court, High Court, they find that provisions are safe and fine. So therefore this appeal came before the Supreme Court finally, that whether these two acts were violative of fundamental right that is guaranteed under Article 25(1) of the Constitution, and whether the state legislature were competent to enact them. So this primary issue came before the Supreme Court. The first issue, that is related to the freedom of religion. So freedom of religion, then what is freedom for one is freedom for the other in equal measure, and there can therefore be no such thing as a fundamental right to convert any persons to one's own religion. So as we know that the Article 25 itself basically prohibits the forceful conversion, or if one person has certain fundamental rights, he can enjoy his fundamental right, but he cannot force the another person to enjoy in a similar manner or with the same manner, or you can say follow the same religion. It is the right which has been given, or which has basically present or existed in the society or in this world by the nature. There is nothing that one person can share or give his right to another. Obviously under the doctrine of Weber also, that right cannot be taken away or cannot be transferred. So public order as exception, wherein given that expressions, allurement or fraud have been defined under the Act itself. Section 3 of this Madhya Pradesh Act prohibits conversion by use of force or by allurement or by fraudulent means, and Section 4 penalizes such forcible conversion. So here, very important to note down that in this Act, the Section 3 and 4 itself very well within the Article 25 of the Constitution of India, because they also prohibits the conversion by force, and if there is a conversion by force, there is a provision which is mentioned under section 4 that such forcible conversion should be punished by law. So therefore, similarly, if we go to the Orissa Act, again section 3 and 4 having the similar kind of provision wherein they prohibits forcible conversion, and also if there is a forcible conversion, there will be a penal, one person, that wrongdoer will be penalized. So the acts therefore clearly provides for the maintenance of public order, and therefore if there is a forcible conversion, then that is already prohibited by the law, and obviously the public order they have tried to maintain. Now here the word public order, that is also expression that has been defined or that has been explained in the case of Ramesh Thapar versus State of Madras. So that which says that public order is an expression of wide connotation and signifies the state of tranquility which prevails among the members of the political society as a result of internal regulation enforced by the government which they have established, right? Because ultimately the public order is something which maintains the society in proper order, and that has to be maintained, otherwise there will be a lot of disturbance. So therefore finally it was held that the impunged acts, that is both acts which are in question, fall very well within the purview of entry 1 of list 2 of 7 schedule, as they are meant to avoid disturbance to the public order by prohibiting the conversion from one religion to the another in a manner reprehensible to the conscience of the community. And the two acts do not provide for the regulation of religion, or we do not find any justification for the argument that they fall under the entry 97 of list 1 of the 7th schedule, because this entry 97 list 1 nothing but the residuary power of the union or the parliament. So here the purpose for which act is enacted, or the object for which act is enacted, or the provisions of that relevant act is not creating any disturbance in the public order, are not creating or violating the Article 25 of the Constitution. So there is no question that declaring that that law as an invalid one. So therefore both the laws are very well valid, and therefore both can be applied in a smooth manner. So there is a next case now, this SR Chaudhary versus State of Punjab. So in this case, again this very interesting case wherein there was a reappointment of a minister for every 6 months without elected as a member of Legislative Assembly of Punjab. Okay. So in this case there was a respondent number 2 whose name is Sri Tej Prakash Singh. So he was appointed as a minister in the state of Punjab, and on the advice of Chief Minister in the year 1995. Okay, so he was not elected by the people and he became the member of the legislature. No, he was directly appointed by the Chief Minister on his advice, and he became the minister. Now only the requirement is that once he become the minister, now he has to contest, or he has to prove that he can be a member of the legislature within next 6 months. But he failed to get himself selected as a member of the legislature of the state of Punjab within period of 6 months, and therefore he submitted his resignation from the Council of Ministers in the year 1996. So he could not prove himself as a member of legislature, even the members did not give the vote, and therefore he could not become the member. But further, the chief minister who has contested the election, who became the chief minister, their government basically dissolved, and therefore the term of same legislative assembly, there was a change in the leadership of the ruling party. So another chief minister was appointed for the state of Punjab in the year 1996. So after 6 to 7 months, another chief minister was appointed. When another chief minister was appointed, then he again reappointed the same minister, again with the similar manner, without contesting the election, directly appointed as a minister, and again he failed to prove the same. So here there was a big question that was raised, that the petition in that case that was filed, that appointment of respondent number 2 for the second time during the term of the same legislature without being elected as a member of legislative was violative of the constitutional provisions, and therefore it is bad. So here the contention that was put up, or the case was filed against this particular reappointment, because that this practice is basically a bad practice, because if the member who is not already, or he could not prove his candidature or his selection, like in the member of this legislature earlier, again the same person is reappointed with the same ministry or same position, then that gives the bad practice, or that also promotes the bad practice. So therefore, and also violate the constitutional provision. So therefore, division bench of High Court dismissed the writ petition in limine. Then the matter came before the Supreme Court by way of special leave petition, and the issue now in this case raised that can a non-member of legislature who fails to get elected during the period of 6 consecutive months, like in the first term, and after he is reappointed as a minister, or while a minister has ceased to be legislator, be reappointed as a minister without being elected to the legislature after the expiry of the period of 6 consecutive months, whether it is right or not. So the court referred 164 article of the Constitution of India, wherein the governor shall appoint the chief minister exercising his own discretion according to the established practice and convention, and all other ministers are appointed by the governor on the advice of the chief minister. So his appointment has been done by the valid person. There is no question on that. But what about the other principles? So in view of the provisions of 164(2), the Council of Ministers shall all be collectively responsible for the Legislative Assembly of the state, right? And this is, however, is the subject to an exception provided by the Article 164 to meet the extraordinary situation wherein the Chief Minister considers the inclusion of particular person who is not a member of legislature in the Council of Minister necessary. Okay, so it is a power that is given by Article 164 itself to the Chief Minister, that he can exclude the person or include the person who is not a member, who is not elected by the people, but still he can appoint that person as a minister. But when we talk about the principle of constitution, so as we talk about the constitutionalism, or when we talk about the constitution, then what are the principles that we generally follow? Like one principle is the parliamentary democracy. So it envisages what? That it includes the representation of the people, it includes the responsible government, it includes the accountability of the Council of Ministers to the legislature. So when one person becomes the member of legislature, whether it is elected by the people or whether it is on the advice of Chief Minister, that person is ultimately going to represent the particular state, particular constituency. Also it going to represent the law which is going to be enacted by that respective state legislature. So whole responsibility that comes to in the hand of minister. And if minister is of such nature who is appointed or who is not able to prove his presence in the state legislature, then whether it is correct to reappoint the same person on the same position. So here the character and the content of parliamentary democracy is the ultimate analysis, depends on the quality of persons who man the legislature as representative of the people. It is said that elections are the barometer of democracy and contestants are the lifeline of the parliamentary system and its setup. So reappointment of such person who fails to get elected as a member within the period of 6 consecutive months would not only disrupt the sequence and scheme of the Article 164, but would also defeat the subvert of the basic principle of representative and responsible government, because it is not only giving the disrespect to the one of the article, that is Article 164, but also it will be violative of the principles of the representation and responsible government. So therefore, according to the court, the reappointment of the respondent number 2 was improper, undemocratic, invalid and unconstitutional. So hence his reappointment is accordingly set aside, and therefore at this point there is no consequences. So his appointment was set aside. Now there is third case, that is All India Reporter Karmachari Sangha versus All India Reporter 1988. Now in this case, the primary question that was raised, that whether this All India Reporter, which is considered as the document which basically published several reports such as the Criminal Law Journal, Labor Law Industrial Cases, Taxation Reports, Allahabad Law Journal, UP Law Tribunal. So this published by the All India Reporter. So whether the law, that is the Working Journalist and Other Newspaper Employees and Miscellaneous Provisions Act, whether this will be applicable to the reporter also, because primarily this Working Journalist and Other Newspaper Employees Act is basically applicable to the workers who are working for the news, that is print media, you can say. But here, All India Reporter is basically a document is in such a nature that whatever the judgment that has been passed by the judiciary or the tribunals, that will be reported in the All India Reporter, and that All India Reporter will be released by the All India Reporter so that public can get the access about the judgment order that is passed by the court or the tribunal. So whether the newspaper and the All India Reporter can be equated together and can both will have the benefits out of this particular act. So therefore, whether the employees of respondent number 1 engaged in the production and publication of said law reports are entitled to benefits conferred upon the employees of the Newspaper Establishment Act. So that was the primary question. So now section 2B of this particular act defines what is newspaper. But if you refer the meaning of the word news, means the tidings, new information, recent event, new occurrence as the subject of the report or the talk. So respondent 1, that is All India Reporter, what they do? They also does some of the similar work that All India Report Limited and other publishers of law reports, in the interest of their own business with each other, to publish the judgment of the Supreme Court or of the High Courts as early as possible to their law reports, which are published periodically, either weekly, fortnightly or monthly. So AIR is basically also published like newspaper, like every week, fortnightly or monthly or periodically. So they believe that faster the decisions are published in the reports, larger will be the number of the subscriber. So it is by the reading these law reports they come to know of the latest legal position prevailing in the country on the question decided in the decisions reported in that said report. Hence, it is difficult to agree with the submission that is made on the respondent 1 that law report do not carry any news. So the public is not interested in them. So here All India Reporter basically doing the job which is equally important, which is equally similar to the, you can say, the news what they does. They also All India Reporter also giving the information to the public, in a sense that whatever the judgment that has been passed, that are ultimately going to help the public to understand that what is the view of judiciary, now the society shall accept that law declared by the court, right? Now there is a next case we have State of Mysore versus RV Bidap, wherein the office of member of State Public Service Commission became the chairman of the same commission. So here there is under this State Public Service Commission, there was one member who was appointed as a member, but within next 6 to 7 months, the governor was pleased to appoint him as the chairman of the same commission with the effect of 15th February. So like after 2 years. So in the middle of his term, he claims a fresh 6 year spell. So now here the question basically arises such that when the State Public Service Commission was there, so he appointed as a member. So he served 2 years as a member, and the governor after 2 years promoted him to the chairman. So now question here arises that when one person became the member or chairman of the commission, then whether that person, so as a member he can stay as a member for next 6 years, and as a chairman also he can stay there for 6 years. So question here arises that the person who has already spent 2 years as a member of State Public Service Commission, can he be now, once he now become a chairman, so whether he will get the 6 years to serve or whether he will get only 4 years to serve, because as a member he has already completed 2 years, and as a chairman now he is expecting to serve for next 6 years. So the question, the argument that was put up, that he shall be eligible for only 4 years and not for 6 years. So let us see now what is the opinion of court in this regard. So the state argued that 6 years assured to him by the Article 316 commenced to run from the date he becomes the member and did not receive a fresh start. So from the latter date when he assumed the office as a chairman. So two question arises here, that is there any public policy behind the Article 316 and 319? If so, what is it? And assuming its existence and importance, could this court, while interpreting these provisions of the Constitution, listen to such extrinsic voices, however natural, logical and persuasive, or be guided by the golden rule of grammatical construction, which treats the text of statute as a sort of forensic soundproof room. So the working of the Indian official in administration can easily be and is several times the 6 short years granted by Public Service Commission as a member under Article 3162 of the Constitution. In Article 316 and 319, like if you see here, that both basically relates to the different separate topics, like one is for the appointment of chairman and members and one is for the certain narrow exception against the further employment as a state service. So Article 316(2) is not breached because there is a 6-year term for each office. Because however you may be the member who is holding the office as a member, or when you become the chairman of the same commission, then you have a 6 years of spell independently. It is not that if you have already served as a member, then you will get only 4 years. So therefore, logically and legally, court spelled out an automatic expiry of the office of member on assumption of the office of chairman. So he become the chairman, then he will get the fresh 6 years of the start. So with this, we are now ending with this rule of purposive construction. Now let us move to the next, that is interpretation of penal statutes. Now interpretation of penal statutes and interpretation of tax statutes, both are basically part of rule of strict interpretation. So here there is no scope that court or judiciary can interpret the law in the manner that is a liberal manner, or you can say in a flexible manner. Here the law will be applicable in a very strict sense. So therefore, in defining the criminal offences or prescribing the penalty, fine, imprisonment, the court will have a very strict approach. Court will not have any liberal approach. In a criminal statutes may not be enlarged by the implication or by any implication or any intent beyond the fair meaning of the language used and the meaning that is reasonably justified by its terms. So when you are interpreting the criminal statutes, one may not imply or impliedly assume something or will not understand the intention behind that particular provision or substantive law. The court will be very strict while interpreting the such statutes, and also no need to apply any other implication may be associated with that particular circumstances. So therefore, criminal statutes will not be held to encompass offences and individuals other than those clearly described and provided for in their language. The strict construction of criminal statutes complements the rule of lenity, which holds that ambiguity in criminal statutes should be resolved in favor of the defendant. Now, what do you mean by this rule of lenity? This rule of lenity is nothing but a judicial doctrine requiring that those ambiguities in criminal statute relating to prohibition and penalties be resolved in favor of the defendant, and if it is not contrary to the legislative intent. And also there is this case, that is Mumbai versus Dilip Kumar and Company, others, in the year 2018. It was observed by the Supreme Court that the penal statute which tends to deprive a person of right to life and liberty has to be given strict interpretation, or else many innocent might become victims of discretionary decision making. So if the strict interpretation is not there, then obviously the people who are not, you can say, the people who are not having the power or the victims who have suffered because of the crime, they may face certain challenges. Then in the modern welfare state, there are many statutes prohibiting certain acts, and if the statute also provides for the penalty for disobedience of law, such imprisonment or fine, it will be classed as a penal statutes. Now there are certain situation arises that if two possible constructions can be put upon the penal provision dealing with punishment, the court is duty bound to see that the court must lean towards the construction which exempts the subject from the penalty rather than one which imposes the penalty. So when one provision, if it is giving two meaning, or you can say that is there are two possible constructions are there, then court shall give the benefit of the better interpretation, or the subject who can get the exemption, that should be given. Those not covered by the express language of the penal statute should not be roped in by stretching the language of the law, because here we are talking about the strict interpretation. If the clear or unambiguous language of the statutes are giving the clear meaning, then there is no need to stretch it unnecessary. Then provisions of penal statute cannot be presumed to have a retrospective operation, because generally the penal statutes, generally they have the operations which is prospective in nature and they cannot be applicable retrospective in nature. But also even the judiciary or the court shall not apply or shall not apply the law in a retrospective manner. They will be always prospective in nature. Legislation which deals with the jurisdiction and procedure in relation to the imposition of penalties will be strictly construed. Where certain procedural requirements have been laid down by a statute to be completed in a statute at all, these requirements have been complied with before sentencing the accused. So here there are some of the important exceptions also we have to see. There is, as long as the presumptions of the innocence of the accused prevails in this country, the benefit of any lacuna or causes omissus must be given to the accused. The job of plugging the loopholes must strictly be left to the legislature and not assumed by the court. So there are some important exceptions are here. Number one exception is that the principle of penal statute is to be strictly construed, is not of universal application. So the penal statute, whether that has to be applied strictly or not, that is not universally applicable. The penal statute should be construed in a manner in which suppress the mischief and advance the object which the legislature had in view. And further, even in relation to the penal statute, any narrow and pandemic literal and lexical construction may not always be given effect to. The law would have to be interpreted having regard to the subject matter of the offence and the object of the law it seeks to achieve. The purpose of law is not to allow the offender to sneak out of the meshes of law, and criminal jurisprudence does not say so. So therefore, in the case of state of Madhya Pradesh versus Sri Ram Singh in the year 2000, it was observed that Prevention of Corruption Act is a social legislation and defined to curb the illegal activities of public servants, and it is designed to be liberally construed so as to advance its object. So the procedural delays and technicalities of law should not be permitted to defeat the object that is sought to be achieved by the act. So now let us move to the another interpretation, that is interpretation of tax statute. So interpretation of tax statutes is, again, as I mentioned, that is another example of rule of strict interpretation. So the way the rule of penal statute or interpretation of penal statute, wherein the strict interpretation was the basis or the foundation. Similarly, when it comes to the law relating to the tax, even there the strict interpretation is the mandatory. So in the taxing statutes, one has to look at what is clearly said. There is no equity about a tax, and there is no intendment, there is no presumption as to tax, and nothing is to be read in, nothing is to be implied. So there is no scope for implication, or impliedly the law cannot be, or the tax cannot be imposed upon someone just based on the implication, or just basis on the just implying something, or just without expressly reading the provision, or without expressly reading the financial documents, one cannot impose the tax impliedly. So basic principle for a charge under the tax statute is that no tax can be imposed on the subject without words in the act clearly showing an intention to lay a burden upon him, right? So tax cannot be imposed on the subject without the words in the act. So if the act has clearly mentioned about the imposition of tax, and then and only tax can be imposed. So here burden of proof to bring someone under a charge is on the revenue, and that of bringing assessee under the exemption or deduction is on assessee. If interpretation of fiscal enactment is open to doubt and two views are reasonably possible, then one more beneficial or favorable to the assessee should be adopted. So obviously, again, similarly, if it is penal statute or if it is tax statute, whatever the beneficial interpretation can be taken out, or if it is available, or if it is possible, then that beneficial interpretation can be given to the assessee in such cases. Further, if income is failing or falling in two exempting sections, assessee can choose to fall in both unless they are made mutually exclusive by express provisions or necessary implication. Provisions related to the machinery of assessment or collection should be construed to make it workable, effectuate, to levy and advance the object of the provisions. Then construction of machinery provisions that disables the taxing machinery and enables the person to escape the taxation be avoided. Then penal provisions in case of taxing statute. Now penal provisions and taxing statute, if they come together, then that should be strictly construed. In case of any legislative ambiguity, then assessee should get the benefit of the doubt, because this is nothing but an exception, or you can say that is one of the loophole, or you can say one of the exception that person has when the law itself is not clear, when law itself has certain ambiguity, law itself has certain you can say unclarity in the provisions, then that benefit can be given to the assessee. So there the liberal interpretation sometimes come. So liberal interpretation is required for the provision of appeal and provisions giving refund to the assessee and in favor of the assessee. So in case of provisions creating a rights, court must lean in favor of the construction that saves the right instead of one defeating it. There is a good case wherein the certain exemptions that were discussed here, that in the case of in the constitutional bench decision Supreme Court, Commissioner of Custom Import Mumbai versus Dilip Kumar Company, wherein the in relation to the ambiguity of tax exemption, two important principles that were laid down. That is, one is the exemption notification should be interpreted strictly. The burden of proving applicability would be on the assessee to show that his case comes within the parameters of the exemption clause or exemption notification. When there is ambiguity in exemption notification which is subject to the strict interpretation, the benefit of such ambiguity cannot be claimed by the subject or assessee, and it must be interpreted in favor of revenue. So now here we have another important principle, that is ejus dem generis principle. Now in this ejus generis principle, wherein its correct meaning, or you can say its literal meaning, is nothing but of the same kind. So its rule in respect of use of interpretation of general words, where there are general words following an enumeration of a particular or specific words, the general words must be confined to the things of the same kind as those specified. So in other words, the rule says that whether a particular words are followed by general, the general words should not be construed in their widest sense, but should be held as applying to the objects, persons or things of same nature or a class as those specifically enumerated. So here if there are same class of people or same class of object or same class of subject, can be given a similar meaning or can be considered as in a similar category. So we will take certain examples in this regard. So in the application of this principle, the principle again emphasizes that the importance of the context of statutory interpretation. So there is one example here I quote that a statute prohibited citizens from carrying knives, rifles, pistols, club, brass knuckles or any other such implements on their person. If a person was found to carrying a machine gun, will the same be considered as covered under the prohibition that is imposed? Now here what we have to understand is that when a statute is prohibiting such category of things like knives, rifles, pistol, brass or any other such implements, then can this machine gun be equated, or can machine gun will be equated with this other category of implements? Then the answer to this is yes. It seems likely that the machine gun would be interpreted to be prohibited implement. So therefore this could also be a part of a weapon. So machine gun may be a part of weapon, and therefore this can be of the same kind. This can be also considered as the same kind. So extending further, can we say that the garden spade would also under this prohibited implements? Then answer is no. Although it's also an implement tool, but it does not share the same nature as that of the specific terms. So machine gun may have the impression, or person if look at the machine gun, that may give the impression that it may be of similar nature of the weapon, but the garden spade may not give that impression, because that is used for the garden, and the picture, if you see both the pictures of machine gun and garden spade, both will have a different picture. So one may look similar to the weapon, but one may not look similar to the weapon. We'll take another example here, that if the law refers to the automobiles, trucks, tractors, motorcycles and other motor power vehicles, then question here arises that this other motor power vehicles would include airplanes or not. So again, answer to this is no, that other motor powered vehicles would not include airplanes, since the list was of the land based transportation. So like all other rules, it serves as an aid to discover the intention of legislature. It is neither final nor conclusive and is attracted only when the specific words enumerated constitute a class which is not exhausted and are followed by the general terms. So ultimately what we can gather from this principle is that if the particular thing is of same class, same nature or same category, then one can give the meaning, or one can give the reference of the same class, same category, same object, and will be considered the same. So there are certain advantages and disadvantages of this particular principle. So if we see the advantages, then there is no requirement for the draftman to write an exhaustive list of everything that is included. They can simply write few and rest will be understood with the same class, same object, same category. The second, that act can cover circumstances which might have been covered by the draftsman. Further, it allows the act to adapt the changes in society. And the disadvantages are there, that it is not always predictable what the judges will consider to be same category as specific words. It allows the judicial law making which is not desirable. That these are certain disadvantages, because it is not always predictable what judges will consider, because as a human being one may look at the things in a different manner, and as a maybe a judge one may look the things again in a different manner. So therefore there is no uniformity, or there is no clear structure that how one may look at the certain category of things, whether it is like for example weapon, or whether it is other motor vehicles or not. So one may have a different kind of interpretation towards the thing. So therefore the category, whether that will fall or not, that is again disadvantages. So it depends upon the judicial thinking and the law makers thinking, and also the person who is claiming for the same. Now moving ahead, we have another important principle here, that is noscitur associis. So here it is nothing but that it is known by its associates. So word takes meaning from the company it keeps. So according to this principle, the associated words take their color or meaning from the one another if the context of the statute so suggested. So according to Maxwell, when two or more words which are susceptible of analogous meaning are coupled together, they are understandable to be used in their cognate sense. They take as it were their color from each other, that is, the more general is the restricted to less general or particular having a certain meaning. So if word whose meaning is uncertain, questionable or doubtful can be understood and defined by its association with surrounding words and its context. So therefore, if we see the application of this principle, then it is quite frequently applied in the construction of statute, will, agreement and including the insurance policies. So in the first example, if we see Dr. Devendra M. Surti versus State of Gujarat, the court was dealing with the definition of commercial establishment. Now what include in the commercial establishment? That is the primary question. So here commercial establishment means an establishment which carries any business or trade or the profession. Okay. Now whether the private dispensary of a doctor fall within the definition of commercial establishment, that is now the main question here, whether the private dispensary of doctor will fall under the same definition of commercial establishment. So the word profession was construed with the associated words business and trade, and the Supreme Court held that the private dispensary of a doctor was not within the definition of commercial establishment given in the Act. And second example we have here is the Pradeep Agarbatti Ludhiana versus State of Punjab 1998, which dealt with the interpretation of term that is word perfumery as used in the Schedule A, entry 16 of Punjab Sales Act, which reads as, so what includes in the perfumery? Cosmetics, perfumery, toilet goods, excluding the toothpaste, tooth powder, kumkum and soap. Now question here arises that whether the dhoop and agarbatti will again fall under the perfumery. So with reference to the Punjab Sales Tax Act held that the word perfumery means such articles as used in cosmetics and toilet goods, sprays, but does not include the dhoop or agarbatti. So however the similar kind of feature they may have, which may have given a good perfumery smell, etc., but both have the different object, purpose and usefulness. Now moving ahead, if we see the comparison between these two, Ejodum generis versus Noscitur saucis, then Ejodum generis and Noscitur saucis have their origin as a common law canons of construction used to assist the interpretation of statutes. There is a degree of overlap in both canons, and Ejodus generis can be seen as a specific application of the more general canon of Noscitur saucis. Although theoretically separate, these two Latin maxims essentially make the same point, that is, the meaning of ambiguous word or a phrase within a statute is to be inferred from the context in which it appears. So Noscitur saucis is the rule wider than the Ejodum generis, and the latter rule is only the application of the formal rule. Now the last principle we have here is the rule of harmonious construction. So when the law is enacted, generally it is presumed that the text of that law is clear and not ambiguous, but sometimes there are certain inconsistency arises, and to resolve that inconsistency or to come out from that inconsistency, there is a need to make the balance between these two opposite provisions of the law. So therefore, to bring the harmony between the law, to bring the harmony between these two opposite provisions, one needs to interpret the law in the harmonious manner. So there is a famous Shankari Prasad case wherein the court has applied this principle, rule of harmonious construction, in the Indian Constitution, stating that the fundamental rights and the directive principle of state policy are harmonious to each other. They are not opposite to each other, and both are supplementary and complementary to each other. In the Apex Court, there is one famous case, that is the Commissioner of Income Tax versus Hindustan Bulk Carrier in the year 2003, wherein few important principles were raised on the harmonious construction. That is, first is to avoid all circumstances of direct clash between provisions. Again, one provision shall not defeat the importance of another provision unless there seems no possible construction. The courts may decide to reconcile both provisions to give effect. Any construction that renders one provision of the statute or another statute in case of two different statutes, unless or dead letter, should not be given effect. Such construction is not a harmonious construction. So in the conclusion, I would like to state that as we have discussed several principles of rules and the rules of interpretation of statutes. So the first, as we see in the ut res magis velit quam petirit, it is nothing but it is better for a thing to have the effect than to make that law void. Then the rule of purposive construction is nothing but the extension of the mischief rule. Then third we have is the interpretation of penal statute and tax statutes, which adheres to the strict interpretation of the law, but also in the exception that tribunal interpretation sometimes allowed when interpreting the penal statute and tax statutes. Then there is the Ejodum generis principle, which is nothing but talking about the category, that is same kind of class, subject, object, wherein the same category can be matched with the other categories. Then Noscitur saucis, it is known by its associate again, and the rule of harmonious construction, wherein the balance has to be maintained between the two or more provisions if they are opposite to each other, and such provision cannot be declared as invalid. The court has to try to maintain the balance between both of them, wherein we have seen the example like harmonious construction, that is maintained between the fundamental rights and the directive principle of state policy. So with this I conclude my lecture, and I thank you all the viewers for listening to this lecture. Thank you.